As a Facebook user, often far from my site of research, Southeast Asia, I found myself more than once relying on a friend's posting of footage of a few minutes of performance art taken from their mobile phones to view a particular artist's work in my absence. No matter how well my friend may have filmed a particular event, never have I considered those clips to be substitutes for a live version, nor have I considered them to be representations of the work in themselves. Could someone close the door, please? Very distracting. Thank you. Artists don't usually use Facebook to post their own professional footage, nor can they necessarily control the clandestine taping of their work. They may or may not welcome the attention or appreciate the free publicity, but they would care, naturally, should the recording be mistaken or, in the worst case, sold for their actual work. A distinction, therefore, must inevitably be made between an artist's presentation and representation of their work via a professional documentation of a piece and a viewer's amateur capture of it. This may be more clearly understood in our era of social networking and portable recording devices than it was for works that were recorded 20 years ago, before the documentation and archiving mania began, or in a part of the world where performance events were never meant to be recorded as artists did not want them nor were able to. It is in this context, however, that I would like to discuss the case of Dr. Ray Langenbach, an American artist and scholar who has lived and worked in Malaysia and Singapore for over 20 years, and since 1988 took pains to record on DV and Hi8 film nearly every performance art event that he attended in the region. These recordings that could translate as the low-tech, pre-Facebook era bystander accounts have now taken on greater importance art historically speaking. For one, since Dr. Langenbach was, in many cases, the only person to document a particular performance, his recording is the only one available for viewing even to the artist whose work was recorded. For another, they have now entered the collection of the Asia Art Archive and are available for researchers in that organization's library in Hong Kong. They have now become, in my opinion, by definition, art historical documents, not only as visual traces of Southeast Asian artists' works, but as the records of a particular person, in this case, Dr. Langenbach's research in the performance art of the region, the subject of his doctoral dissertation. These recordings then offer us a view not only into the history of Southeast Asian performance art, but also into the nature of art historical research at that time and the role that archives play in the construction of art historical memory today. We can consider Dr. Langenbach's archive in three ways. First, as documentary footage of performance pieces that stand in lieu of a live, physically present work, in which case our attention turns to the artist whose work is portrayed in the film. Secondly, we can consider these films as Ray Langenbach's work and study his role as a witness to these events and researcher of the history of performance art in Southeast Asia. Thirdly, they can be viewed more problematically as blurring the lines of authorship from one artist to another, as both the work of Ray Langenbach and of the artist whose work is documented, a kind of post-production collaborative venture in which both the artist and the documenter participate. All three perspectives shed light on the construction of art historical memory as they reveal the afterlife of performance art. So it was interesting that Li Mingwei was talking about that. I'm very glad about the coincidence of those topics. For the sake of time, I will briefly mention only a few of the recordings, one in particular, and examine them within the context of Singapore art history. I'll then analyze their presence as archival material in the collection of Asia Art Archive, as both artifacts and documents of artifacts. These perspectives can be combined to highlight Langenbach's role in legitimizing performance art in a region where avant-garde and experimental art practices were struggling to gain recognition. After obtaining a BFA from Tufts and an MFA from Arizona State University, American-born Ray Langenbach came to Southeast Asia to head the sculpture department at the University of Science, Malaysia, in 1988. In 1993, he took a position at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore until 1996. Langenbach was in the region during seminal years in the formation of contemporary art in those countries. 1988 marks the year when artist Tang Da Wu, having returned to Singapore after studying in England, founded the Artist Village, an art community in a compound located in a former Malay village or kampong, where artists gathered and produced work. At that time, the only place to view modern and contemporary art was in Singapore's Seoul Museum, the National Museum, which also had an art gallery. The Artist Village was not so much an exhibition space as a giant studio where artists could play around with materials, create work, and collaborate with others. Once in a while, open studios were held as well as New Year events where artists took turns performing. It is fitting that performance art was born there, outside of an institutional framework, for it enabled artists to pursue other performance projects in public places before it was properly defined as an art form. Although the land where the Artist Village was stationed was reclaimed by the government in 1989, so only 1 year later, the community and various satellite groups that had formed there continued to, and indeed still, participate in art events around the city. Langenbach filmed these events and over the course of a decade, and these films are classified by Asia Archive in a scheme they call a tree that includes a general folder labeled Performance Art in Singapore, a smaller folder labeled The Artist Village, and then subfolders of performances by the artists you see here. I won't enumerate them. Some folders also contain video stills available for viewing online, as opposed to the actual film footage that is only accessible on site in Hong Kong. There are, for example, stills of a 1999 untitled performance by Li Wen and several of Amanda Hang's works, including Washing Exercises from 1997, performed in Bangkok, Sing Girl from 2000, and Let's Walk from the same year, just to name a few. And these videos attest to the global networks of performance art in which Singaporean artists took part. In a separate folder labeled Fifth Passage Artists are two folders, with one containing films of the performances at one particular event of note, the Artists General Assembly, or AGA's 1993-1994 New Year's Eve program in a space called Fifth Passage in Parkway Parade Mall. That folder contains 16 films related to that event, including improvisational performances, a critique session, and, most interestingly, footage of a mock trial in relation to the obscenity charge against the artist Joseph Ng for his performance that night. That performance in particular has secured a place in the annals of performance art history, not only for the obscenity charge, but also because of the government's decision in the aftermath of the AGA event to not fund, which is tantamount to not allowing licensure for performance events. It is known in Singapore art circles as the ban on performance art that lasted for a decade. The performance in question, Brother Kane, was a 25-minute performance in protest against an undercover police raid on a homosexual cruising district in Singapore. After placing blocks of tofu and bags of red dye onto tiles and whacking them with a cane, toward the end of the performance, the artist, wearing only briefs, walked to a corner of the gallery and, with his back to the audience, lowered his briefs and presumably snipped a few strands of pubic hair. He pulled his briefs back on and returned to the performance space and declared, "I heard that the clipping of pubic hair was a form of protest," and laid the hairs onto a pile of smashed tofu. Ng was not the only artist charged that evening, so was Shannon Tam, but Ng's performance, because of the pubic hair, was the one most covered in the media. The organizers were also fined for promoting the event. If you don't know, punishment in Singapore is by caning, which is why the reference to cane. Langenbach's footage of the performance is the only known recorded video documentation of it. Before Asia Archive's acquisition of the tape, few people had actually seen it other than those who were present during the live performance. Because there were no outlets for the distribution of performance videos at the time, Eng's piece became the subject of rumor, especially because of the precarious position of performance art in Singapore art circles. Langenbach's tape thus provides evidence of the work itself. But his presence was key for another reason. He and others attending the event were called upon to testify on Eng's behalf at his hearing at the subordinate courts the following May 16, 1994. His affidavit, which was later posted on a website along with another critic, Lee Weng Choi, also in attendance, Chronology of a Controversy, became the blueprint for a younger artist, Liu Zihan's re-performance of Brother Cane in Chicago in February 2011. Langenbach's blow-by-blow, minute-by-minute written account of Eng's performance was so vivid that Zeynep transformed it into a performance piece in its own right by turning it into a script that he read in between his enactments of Eng's movements. Performatively speaking, Liu Zihan's reenactment of Brother Cane via Langenbach's text is, of course, fascinating, because he does not simply borrow or adapt Eng's gestures and movements as visual clues for his own performance, since he had never seen it, but rather he uses Langenbach's text as his score, thus privileging the viewer, the witness to the performance over the artist or author of the original performance. By transforming Langenbach's testimony into a work of art, Liu's re-performance also underscores the art historical importance, not just of Eng's performance piece, but also Langenbach's documentation of it. This renders Langenbach's archive more complex from an art historical perspective. One could think of Langenbach as a curator of Singapore performance art, but we must not downplay the role that Asia Art Archive also plays in solidifying the critical importance of performance art in Singapore at this time by acquiring it and making it available to a wider audience. Now, the performance took another turn when Liu staged it in Singapore the following year, for he invited Langenbach himself to come and read the text that he had written in 1994. In his doctoral dissertation completed at the University of Sydney in 2004, Langenbach stated that performance art, although it arrived relatively late as compared to its formation in Europe and America, was, and I quote, the single most dynamic area of Singapore culture during the 1990s. The rapid and energetic development may have been in part due to its freshness, and most importantly, its early avoidance of either government approval or approbation, the former leading to soft control through funding, and the latter leading to hard control through censorship. End of quote. Langenbach's dissertation situates Singapore performance art in time and place. The time is the late 1980s and the early 1990s, before the Singapore government established cultural institutions for exhibiting and viewing contemporary art, before it recognized performance art as a contemporary art practice, and ironically shunned it from mainstream practices after that. Contemporary art, therefore, could only be displayed in non-governmental spaces, which gave it a certain amount of freedom until the fated events of 1993 and 1994 at the Fifth Passage Mall. The bulk of Asia Art Archive, or Ray Langenbach's archive, centers on the artist village for that reason. It also includes interviews with artists and scholars and documentation on arts festivals and performance conferences. Langenbach's archive is not meant to be a comprehensive history of Singapore performance art. Langenbach recorded what he attended and what he saw. We must therefore not look to the archive as an inventory of performance art practices in Singapore, as these films are limited to Langenbach's own experiential encounters with performance art during this time. For example, he includes only one work by Chandrasekaran that was labeled under a side folder that you had to dig through, called Independent Artists. However, Chandrasekaran actually had formed a group with two others, Goi Chu and Saleh Japar, that was called Trimurti in the late 1980s, around the same time as the founding of the Artist Village. Trimurti felt that Tang Da Wu and the artist village were copying the West, whereas they were concerned with connecting with their Asian roots, or what Langenbach in his dissertation called Asian spirituality. Chandrasekaran created a series of performances based on Hindu concepts of cosmic energy, tantra, and yogic practices. Trimurti's references to Asian religions resonated actually with the political rhetoric of Asian values promoted by the state, whereas Tang Da Wu and the members of the artist village performances were much more interested in challenging art's limits and exploring the notion of arts for art's sake. So to conclude, Langenbach's archive reveals the complex relationship between performance artists and their audience, and in this case, when the viewer or the witness has written these performances into art history. In its nascent state in the 1980s and 1990s, the audience for performance art in Singapore consisted almost exclusively of other artists, as the cultural institutions either did not exist or were not interested in the medium. That artists such as Tang Da Wu, Li Wen, and Amanda Hang gained prominence was also thanks to someone like Langenbach, who took an interest in them early in their career. While art historians are fortunate to have access to these films in order to complete their picture of Singapore art history, there are still debates as to their authorship and intent. And I heard several artists who strongly believe in the ephemeral nature of their art form express an objection to the very existence of Langenbach's films and their place in Asia archives. They resent the permanence that it implies. But actually, Asia Archive has long promoted the archive as a living resource, and these videos will help engage new audiences with Singapore art from a viewer's perspective rather than as a document of an artist's work. And more importantly, in my view, it stresses the importance of personal or individual archives as opposed to state archives, especially in the case of Singapore that has exercised control not only over the practice of performance art, but the diffusion of information and art historical writing about performance art. So Langenbach's archive provides access to the art form from the inside rather than from the outside. Thank you.
At this time, I'm just introducing very quickly Qasim, Riza SHAHEEN. Unfortunately, he was not able to join us because his dad had a heart attack just last week. He was planning to be here in person to deliver this talk and let me know what was going on, and we really wanted him to be present here. He's living in Manchester, originally from Pakistan, and his particular performance practice, I thought, really would bring a different nuance and voice to the forum here. And I encourage him to find a way to insert himself. And given that most of his practice actually is done in a way where he is also absent and others practice and play him in a way similar to Ming Wei's practice of strangers connecting, we came up with this idea where he could send a recording of what he wanted to say or discuss. So it's called Undelivered Mail, I believe. I can't recall. I'm going to make sure I have the title correct. Yes, Undeliverable Mail. So let's go ahead and start. Thank you so much.
As an artist who is always working with the body, this is very odd standing here talking about my work to the lens, which I have a very different relationship with my work, because I don't talk to the lens. I'm usually quite silent, and I'm in a persona or a series of personas. And I think that's really interesting, even as this thing is happening right now, me talking into the lens. I'm experiencing very different things to what I would normally experience in making my work. So what I do is I try to turn oneself into a subject. And then I start to consider and ponder about subjectivities and possibilities of looking at oneself. And instantly, one of the main key reactions to a lot of my practice is that it's about the artist, or it's autobiographical, it is about narcissism, this is utter self-indulgence, and this is all about him, and he's talking about himself, and he's been talking about himself for a really long time. And all of those comments are absolutely fair, and I can understand where they're coming from, because the protagonist or the person within all of my works is a reflection or an adaptation of myself. But I would like to kind of take a few steps back in terms of thinking through my own practice as I'm talking, and I'm thinking about the idea of the mirror. So most people understand the mirror as a way of, prepping oneself or getting ready, or even to some extent understanding the mirror in terms of adulation, and very closely related to ideas of ego and affirmation, personal affirmation. But I'm kind of looking at the mirror as possibly a point of self-reflection, or a self-interrogation, or a critique, which is often talked about in Christianity, it's talked about in Islam, in terms of muhasabah, in terms of taking account of who you are. So the mirror becomes a way of reflecting upon yourself beyond the exterior. And I think the narratives that I'm exploring in my practice around Sufism are very much to do with making love to the ego to the point of annihilation. So one has to go through a process of self-love in order to free oneself from their own being. And I know that this probably sounds quite existentialist and perhaps not easily grasped as a concept, but what I wanted to do was try to make that more accessible by using or referencing contemporary icons like Amy Winehouse, like Leeza AHMADY, looking at Rock Hudson, who was an icon in the 50s and 60s for second generation migrants in the UK who started to model their notions of masculinity on these Hollywood actors. So on the one hand, the work does look at ideas of sainthood, 14th, 15th century saints, the likes of Baba Balisha, Madhullah Hussain, Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya, and looking at the lineage of Sufism and how some of these ideas are reflected or translated. And then at the same time, I'm juxtaposing that with looking at contemporary icons and how one can still discover oneself through the object of one's affection. I want to talk about a work entitled The Bride of Khusro, which I shot in 2003 in Karachi, in Pakistan. This work is an imaginary wedding procession between myself and a saint who had lived many hundreds of years ago. And I wanted in some way mark or pronounce that re-engagement with a text that I was very familiar with through Sufi narratives, Qawwali, poetry, but I wanted to personify that experience, I wanted to enact it. And by doing that, I was seeing myself very much as a ventriloquist of that experience, where I was becoming a female subject on a male body and translating poetry which was written by men as though they were women. So there's a lot of layering of gender and negotiating of gender going on within that literary context and the genre of Sufi writing, where gender is seen as a metaphor for the master and the disciple, or the lover and the beloved. And in some ways, a lot of that goes beyond the realm of human love and talks about divinity and divine love. But then I was also really curious about the idea that I'm very much a British artist, born up in Manchester, and have this narrative that's been built down through generations and passed on to me, and how I make it my own within the artistic language that I employ, whether that's live art or performance-based work. And I've lost my train of thought. scones and jam and cream and tea. And we were talking about the idea of contemporary art. We're talking about how it becomes really accessible. And one of the key things that are coming out in terms of invigilators giving me feedback is that a lot of people come in, they see it, but they don't get it. And like the gallery needs some, I don't know, interpretation. I was sort of defending that a little bit by saying curatorially it allows people to make the work their own in some way. That they can walk into a space, they can recognize those cultural signifiers, those symbols, that familiarity, but at the same time what I'm trying to do is slightly destabilize that or displace that so that they can kind of create new readings or enter the work with their own sort of backstory, if you like. I can't completely separate myself from talking about the work and making the work, even though I want to do that in some way. I'd like to have that space where I can say that now I'm able to separate or divorce myself from the work in the gallery, and here I'm out of the gallery and talking to you. But the thing that the key things that I want to talk about are my thematic interest, which is looking at how Sufism can be understood in a contemporary British context, and how stories and narratives that are centuries old and from very specific geographical space and time can be applied to where I'm at now, and how some of those elements of devotion can be explored and regenerated into relationships with popular cultural icons. This idea of narcissism or self-portraiture. But I want to try to look at it out of the frame of narcissism. One can't entirely remove that notion, but what you can do is try to talk about or try to understand this work in the context of self-reflexivity and self-discovery through photographing oneself. And we live in a world at the moment where the selfies become so huge. I think selfies are becoming less about self-love and more about this idea of documenting that we also were and we also are present in a world where we're bombarded with information. And as technology and information are kind of are growing, we as individual subjects are desperate to try to mark our existence. And I think in that way, classic realist paintings and selfies from mobile phones today have a very, have that connection of being able, that desperate need or desire to lock oneself in a period of time or a moment. And I think when I'm making work, I'm thinking very much about the self beyond the physical and trying to understand the self as a mechanism where multiple stories from different subjectivities can be expressed. So I become a reflector or a mediator for source communities or different people or just individuals that can in some way blur the line between you and me. And how when I understand, when I project myself, I'm offering you something which you then as a viewer offer back to me, filtered through your own narratives. So it becomes this cyclical reciprocity between different individuals. So that's the thing I wanted to talk about, which is, like I said, the narratives of Sufism and how they apply in my work. That is self-reflexivity and the mirror. This idea of memory, how we, as individuals, we collect. We're obsessed with collecting, whether that's objects, artifacts, items, things we purchase, and we extend our bodies, our physical bodies, into spaces and studios and homes which reflect or in some way embody our existence. And I think artifact and object in that way also becomes a portrait, a self-portrait. So something that's kept in someone's bathroom cabinet becomes a very clear indication of the kind of personality, the kind of person they are. the sort of food they buy, the shops they purchase, their groceries also maybe reflect a little bit about their personal economy. So I think I'm looking at portraiture in a much broader sense. I'm looking at portraiture and how can I possibly discover or reevaluate the self on other people and other bodies. So recently I've been working with a fashion model, so he is becoming this extension of myself, where I'm now looking at how he can embody elements or notions or stories or perceptions that I carry about who I am, and how that I becomes much bigger than individual ego.
My son is sitting beside me and has asked me to read and somewhat inhabit a letter he wrote entitled Undeliverable Pay. You baked me a sweet birthday cake and drove with it through rides in Lahore, thus giving me another reason to eagerly desire it. In Chicago, I imagined you would wait for me for no reason whatsoever. You stood amidst a crowd outside Chicago Theater on North State Street wearing a red sweater, I think, or perhaps it was a periwinkle blue. I had said I would turn up, and you probably forgot that I had not kept the promise. But I think you kept waiting for at least a few weeks on consecutive Saturday nights from sharp 8:33 p.m. till 8:42 p.m. I imagine that scenario just in case I believe you lie, if you decide to tell me one, about your time in Chicago and how I didn't turn up as promised. You have these sandals that you wear repeatedly at functions. They make you look older and married, even at a time when you were neither. I liked you in them, but preferred you in your old cutouts. You baked bread and made an entire home with it, where I hope we could dwell in bliss. In actual fact, you started to do that, but changed your mind halfway through the build. You preferred the remaining architecture to be demolished in your head. I settled for half a fruitfully rotting house at the end of a trail of sweetmeats. You also liked dismantling yourself there. I stood outside choking on a handful of sugar. Truth be told, I rather wanted to charm you into keeping me in some way, perhaps as a gingerbread man of sorts, preserved and iced monumentally beneath a glass panel with a cryptic message like my parents wouldn't happily approve of you ever after. I know, but I still liked you enough to imagine my rejection on a bold black vinyl Verdana font. You held me once in a picture as though I were dead. I could feel you breathe against my neck as I noticed a droplet of sweat glide down the side of your face before it hit me and mixed with mine. I don't think we will ever meet quite in that way again, or perhaps little Gretel we will, on a school night at Gloria Jean's in Phase 5, where we will drink American coffee and smile. Warmly, Qasim.
Everything moves continuously. Immobility does not exist. Don't be subject to the influence of out-of-date concepts. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Accept instability. Live in time. Be static with movement. For a static of the present moment. Resist the anxious wish to fix the instantaneous, to kill that which is living. Stop insisting on value which cannot but break down. Be free, live. Stop painting time. Stop evoking movement and gesture. You are movement and gesture. Stop building cathedrals and pyramids which are doomed to fall into ruin. Live in the present, live once more in time, and by time for a wonderful and absolute reality. Jean Tinguely, manifesto entitled for Statistics, which was printed on 15,000 flyers that were released from an airplane over Düsseldorf, Germany, before an exhibition. Everything moves continuously, except instability. Be static with movement. Stop insisting on value which cannot but break down. Stop painting time. Stop evoking time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Accept instability. Live in time. Be static with movement. Everything moves continuously. Stop building cathedrals and pyramids which are doomed to fall into ruin. Be static with movement. Everything moves continuously. Don't be subject to the influence of out-of-date concepts. Be static with movement. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Stop painting time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Stop building cathedrals and pyramids which are doomed to fall into ruin. Be static with movement. Live in time. Be free, live. Live in the present, live once more in time, and by time for a wonderful and absolute reality. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Be static with movement. Be free, live. Stop evoking time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Immobility does not exist. Be static with movement. Be free, live. Live in the present, live once more in time, and by time for a wonderful and absolute reality. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Everything moves continuously. Be static with movement. Everything moves continuously. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Stop building cathedrals and pyramids which are doomed to fall into ruin. Stop painting time. Stop evoking time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Everything moves continuously. Immobility does not exist. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Stop insisting on value which cannot but break down. Stop building cathedrals and pyramids which are doomed to fall into ruin. Stop evoking time and gesture. Everything moves continuously. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Be static with movement. Be static with movement. Resist the anxious wish to fix the instantaneous, to kill that which is living. Be free, lie. Be static with movement. Stop painting time. Everything moves continuously. Don't be subject to the out-of-date concepts. Be static with movement. Stop evoking time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Be free, live. Live in the present, live once more in time, and by time for a wonderful and absolute reality. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Be static with movement. Be free, live. Stop evoking time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Immobility does not exist. Don't be subject to the out-of-date concepts. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Stop building cathedrals and pyramids which are doomed to fall into ruin. Stop insisting on value which cannot but break down. Stop evoking time and gesture. Everything moves continuously. Immobility does not exist. Forget hours, seconds, and minutes. Be free, live. Stop evoking time and gesture. You are time and gesture. Live in the present, live once more in time, and by time for a wonderful and absolute reality. John Tungally, Manifesto entitled For Statistics, which was printed onto 15,000 flyers that were released from an airplane over Düsseldorf, Germany, before an exhibition. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Sorry. I would like to say thanks to Leeza and ACAW team for inviting me here to share my ideas. It was so stimulating yesterday session with all the thinkers and presentations and speakers focusing on the identity and existence of being, which we all are fighting in some or the other way in our times and spaces. I will be sharing my similar concerns about the condition of natural resources, which are our fundamental right, but depleting so rapidly. Oops, I'll be needing that. Sorry, I'll be needing that. Depleting so rapidly seems to have no control over. River Yamuna, one of the holiest river in India, also called Mother Yamuna and life force of the inhabitants around, is one of the most polluted river of India at present. The river can be divided into segments on the basis of hydrological and ecological condition. Water quality of one segment meets the river water quality standards. That only in Himalayas, where it starts from. The barrages formed on the river are playing a major role of escalating the river pollution. Where water flows in, whatever water flows in the downstream after that is the untreated and partially treated domestic and industrial water waste contributed through various drains. The discharge of untreated domestic and industrial effluent have severely affected the quality of Yamuna River, and now it falls under the category E, completely ruling out the possibility of underwater life and domestic supply. Pollution level in the river rising day by day. The Yamuna has been reduced to a small stream draining industrial effluent, sewage, dirt, and other toxic substance. The river reaches Delhi, where I live, to cross its 22-kilometer stretch, and I'm sure it must be scary entering in Delhi, because it becomes a complete sewage once it enters in Delhi. Oops, sorry, I'm too fast. Okay, the slides are here and there, sorry. The river, sorry. The river accounts for more than 70% of Delhi water supplies. Available water treatment facilities are not capable of removing the pesticide traces. Waterwork laboratories cannot even sometimes detect them. Yamuna leaves Delhi as a sewer laden with the city biological and chemical waste. Downstream at Mathura and Agra, this becomes the main municipal drinking water source. Here too, existing treatment facilities are not capable to detect the pollutants contained in river water. Thus, consumers in Mathura and Agra ingest unknown amount of toxic pesticide residues each time they drink the water. This really scares me actually. During dry weather, the flow of the Yamuna River consists almost entirely the effluents rather than the clean water content. On the contrary, the demand of the fresh water has been continuously increasing with the growing population of India and agriculture and industrial demands. All these readings really moved me and made me question myself and feel responsible to the situation. So along with its statistics record, I urge to visit the river often and interact with the people who live around and devotee visiting for its holy properties and doing the holy ceremonies around the river, which come across as a very absurd situation to me. So if you see, the slide on your left, the guy who's taking the holy bath in the river, it's actually a complete sewage right now. And basically, this guy actually moved me to this body of work, which is called Sediment and Other Untitled, where I was looking at the absurd contradiction between belief and reality, where people perform their holy ceremonies around the sewage, assuming it as a river. One winter morning, this guy, this person on your left, visiting, met me during my visit and documenting the river. I was documenting the depletion of the river, and he was having this holy ceremony of praying his ancestors and then taking a holy bath. So it really moved me with the absurdity that, it really churned me. It is very gross to look at taking, bath in this river which is full of filth. So after that, I started working on the project, which is called Sediment and Other Untitled. We are a very proud, country for, our natural resources, where we talk about our natural resources in our national anthem also, where it's basically, talking about its Himalaya ranges and Vindhya ranges and Yamuna and Ganga, and we are very proud in that and sing that. But on the contrary, what we are abusing So, it comes across as a contradiction and hypocrisy and kind of absurd situation for me, that what we are singing and what we are doing. So that made me do this body of work, which is at the back. The photograph is not very good. I'm super bad in documentation of my work. So there is, at the back, there is a national anthem, which is displayed on a pedestal, because I cannot display it on the ground because it's my national anthem. So on the ground, if you see, there is a sludge from the river itself, which has been splashed onto the canvases at the riverbank, while I have to go back, sorry. So this is where you can see that I am splashing the actual sediment from the river onto my canvas. So I did this experiment by putting the actual water and sediment in this test tube, and it was hanging in the gallery space, and after 3 days it blasted, because it was so polluted that there were gases consumed in it, and it was blasted. And so we can imagine that we don't need statistics or scientific research to see the pollutants in the river, what we are going through. So this body of work was being followed by another film which I recently made. It's called Manthan. Manthan was one of the ceremonies or one of the episodes in Vishnu Purana, or ancient literature, which is called, which translate into to churn the ocean, to take out the nectar of immortality from the ocean. So I wanted to kind of create this satire or humor between the title, that what we are having right now and what we are churning out of the river. So the film examines the prospects of mitigating the catastrophe of ecology of the river, the life force, and contrives the situation of the process of churning the deleterious out of the river through the romanticized, performative, picturesque space. So this film is on right now in gallery here at Jack Shaneman in Chelsea. Please go and have a look. I have a solo going on. And the next project I would like to share with you on another issue which I am really concerned about, which is called Black Cloud. The second project, which is not actualized on its own, on its full yet, but has been run through its pilot state, is called Black Cloud. As you can make out that I like to act within the public space and time with active participation by public itself. Black Cloud was slated in 2012 when there was a news flashing in China and India. Oh, this was from the film, sorry. I'm going through two computers. And maybe it's a bit nervous. I'll go faster. I'll talk about this with Leeza. So this is Black Cloud project, where the worst air to breathe in the month of November. Especially Delhi was undercover with thick smog for 2 days, and WHO declares the worst ever. People could die breathing that air. People did complain about the respiratory diseases, and every year India loses lots of lives and workforces through these diseases. So basically this project was done as a pilot project in Bikaner, with the kite flyer clubs. There are a lot of kite flyer clubs in Bikaner and in parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat. So I thought of doing this project where I wanted a collaboration with people to kind of come together and talk about this black cloud and make this actual black cloud with their kind of as a collaborative effort to talk about our environment in these times. So this is how I kind of communicated with them and tried to kind of bring them together, and we were trying to find out the way how we can fly the kites together, because I was not sure that if we can fly thousands of kites together. So we couldn't manage to gather 1,000 people, but we managed with 60 people, and the project can be, can happen. So this is kind of what I wanted to share with you as a performative practice in my work. And this was actually led from my previous project, which is called Negotiated Necessity. So basically, Negotiated Necessity was another performative work in my practice, where I staged these photographs based on all the news about the environment, and another funny reading which I had of Nostradamus' prediction, where he says that people will go pig mouth in 2013 or so. So this was my interpretation for his interpretation, and I staged these photographs in different times and spaces. And this was the display at the gallery, and there were masks hanging, and then people were getting photographed at the exhibition space itself. So I would like to conclude my my talk by manifesto of Stanley Baum for 4000 AD. When science and art are entirely melted together to something new, when the people will have lost their remembrance and thus will have no past, only future, when they will have to discover everything every moment again and again, when they will have lost their need to contact with others, then they will live in the world only colors, light, space, time, sound, and movement. Then color, light, space, time, sound, and movement will be free. No music, no theater, no art, no. There will be sound, color, light, space, time, and movement. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leeza, for the marathon. Thanks to Amika and also to Screen. This talk will be in three short parts: Orientalisms, Colonialisms, and Patriarchies. And it will end with a series of 8 diagrams that I made exploring some of the ideas proposed. So the first section, Orientalisms, will kick off with this question: can Orientalism contain keys to reinvigorating contemporary political art? Which is to say, can Orientalism not be discarded as merely outmoded, regressive, atavistic, imperialist, but rather hold lessons both valuable and useful for contemporary art? And this is a slide of Puccini's Turandot, which is at the Met Opera right now with all of its unmitigated Orientalist fantasies. And in contrast to that is Verdi's Othello, also at the Met, which made the newspapers for not using blackface for the first time. So Orientalism is certainly with us still. But 54 years after Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, 37 years after Edward Said's Orientalism, and 27 after Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, the world is different. This year, China's PMI held down the US Federal Reserve's interest rates, and the sneeze that was the devaluation of the renminbi chilled global markets. So in this economic order, the question is, does Orientalism simply morph into its opposite, into a kind of Occidentalism? And I'd like to think not. As actually my friend David Organjan over there would say, that's too neat a reversal. So, in other words, Zhao Dai Fuk's 2011 gold rendition of Pooh Bear, or its 2014 diamond-encrusted Mickey Mouse, these are not merely obverses, analogs to Cartier's fetishization of the Orient in the 1920s. I would propose that there is something more, there can be something more. A lesson about how to twin culture and politics, for how culture can once again play a pivotal role in politics in contemporary art. So I first read Orientalism and Said's follow-up, Culture and Imperialism, in 1997 in a seminar of Hal Foster's at Cornell. And at that time, it engendered in me all of the righteous and rightful indignation that it was meant to, couched as it was as a signal text of much identity politics of the time. Two examples are here. Now, my second reading of Orientalism was much more recent. This time it was as a teacher at RISD and at VCU. And the question was different. The question now, as it is in this session, is what does identity politics, or say political art broadly, look like outside of the long shadow of 1968? So first, my students' response to Orientalism. Astutely, they asked, what is identity now when it can be had by a click of a mouse, a like, a repost? What challenges does this dividing up of culture and of history into a multitude of tweets and of personal feeds present to artists engaged with identity? And then my own response to this rereading of Orientalism. Surprisingly, I was awed. I was awed by how well the British managed their far-flung empire. I was awed by the fact of empire itself. And most of all, I was awed by what a pivotal role culture, novels in particular, played in empire building, in the annexation and the administration of parts of China, of India, of the Middle East. So, could contemporary art, contemporary political art, look beyond 1968, back to the 18th to the 19th centuries, for cues on how to engage politically, not subversively, but now synthetically? So the proposition is a fraught one. To champion Orientalism is also to champion its inextricable counterpart, colonialism. So to ask if Orientalism could be valued positively today as a model is also to ask if there can be a good or a redemptive side to colonialism. So Britain circa 1945, here's King George VI, flanked by Churchill on the one side and Clement Attlee on the other, prime ministers both. And on the bottom, here is Churchill's wartime cabinet. Old, white, male, many aristocratic, these are the people who reluctantly relinquished India in 1947. But they are also the same people who fought and won a war against fascism for humankind. So both of these events, India, Germany, colonialism, anti-fascism, are driven, at least in part, I think, by belief. By belief that one's system, one's form of governance, one's God, one's country is better. And it is this belief that I would like to see, I think I would like to see more of in contemporary art, rife with indeterminacy, obsessed with ambiguity, and in which pluralism is a given. Belief driven to duty is at once colonialism's arrogance and also perhaps its redeeming quality. It's redeeming because duty to something beyond oneself might be a corrective to a culture tilting towards personal development at the expense of contribution and of engagement. And here we think of my students' observation that history has become a series of feeds that values are reduced to a string of likes. So consider two recent Hollywood blockbusters, 2012 and Ender's Game. In 2012, just as giant waves loll over Earth's remaining land masses and humanity is about to be extinguished, John Cusack, who plays a dad, turns to his son, Noah, and takes precious minutes from saving the world to assure his son that he is loved. In contrast, in Ender's Game, the sci-fi and Orson Scott Card movie Ender's Game, there's a scene where a psychologist tells Harrison Ford, who plays a colonel, you have to be careful about Ender's psychological state. He's young, he's emotional. We can't ask him to carry the burden of saving humanity, of fighting the buggers, the aliens. And Colonel Graff, Harrison Ford, turns to the psychologist and says, I don't care. Ender's emotions don't matter. Much more is at stake. Humanity is at stake. And so Ender's Game, we might say, is a story of duty over desire, of legacy over love, and of humanity over family. And family leads to the third and final part of this presentation, which contains the thesis, the proposal about parenthood as a model for art practice. There is Harrison Ford and Ender. On the left, we have Louis XIV, crowned by an angel. So this tells of the divine right of kings, the direct lineage from God through Adam to the reigning sovereign. And on the right are friends of mine who are artists and who happen to be dads. They're art dads. And so I wonder if there might be a different form of parenthood, or even patriarchy, we might say, that is useful to think about as a model. Now perhaps based on Joseph, St. Joseph, Jesus' foster father, Jesus' dad. Joseph, the carpenter, modest. In this Annunciation, he's on the right-hand side, always in the background, overshadowed by Mary and Jesus. Might there be a model of art practice based on St. Joseph? So, not on Jesus, not on Satan, not on Adam and the divine right of kings, but on something that is more like a lifetime of hard work, aggregative hard work, over bursts of youthful genius. And these are some of the diagrams that I made. On the right-hand side, we have a Platonic cube, our old notion of an ideal, Platonic ideal, transformed as it moves down to the earthy shape of a snail who, over its lifetime, accidentally, without even knowing it, aggregates a perfect golden spiral on its back and dies without ever having seen it. That as a model of art practice. It would also entail pragmatism over idealism, or even ideology, political ideology. The pragmatism, we might say, of a parent. So in this diagram on the right, I won't go through it all, but on the bottom with the check mark, they are excerpts from a practical manual on parenting. And this is in contrast to the left-hand column with Eat, Pray, Love, the book and then movie with Julia Roberts, which that movie speaks much of the continued self-actualization of an adult. And the proposal here is that we can, perhaps must, value discipline over self-actualization. That at a certain point, when one becomes a parent, you have to stop self-actualizing, and even if you're not ready for adulthood, you just have to step up to it. You just have to try. And so, on the right is the diagram of Enders versus 2012, and on the left, it's a speculative story of, say, when a 20-something-year-old Asian, who values self-discipline, who has self-discipline, meets a 20-something-year-old American involved in self-actualization. And to be sure, the best scenario is above, where love happens with diamond heart, a meeting of love and logic, but also the possibility that when this couple enters the 40s, there's a belated adulthood on the American side and a extended adolescence. And on the Asian side, maybe he becomes like middle management, junior banker at a large firm. And as they grow into their 50s, of course, the American has a midlife crisis, and the Asian becomes a total douchebag. No empathy, no emotional intelligence, no self-actualization. But most of all, what I would like to propose is that artists build institutions rather than engage in institutional critique. Build institutions synthetically, even dynastically, rather than subversion, and we talked about this a little bit during the sessions yesterday, rather than subversion or even a kind of punkishness, even a kind of resistance. Synthesis, not resistance. And I will end with these two diagrams, which are for me pictures of contemporary art. I know I don't have too much time left, so I'll just go through the one on the left, where I think, in the 1950s, the museum was the paradigm, and we went through very interesting decades of institutional critique in the 60s and 70s of the founding of alternative spaces of do-it-yourself practices. But of course, as we now know, that same institutional critique is assimilated into the mainstream. Those alternative spaces become centered, become institutions themselves, and those do-it-yourselfers, those freelancers, end up being paradigms for the subject under late capitalism. And I don't want to stop there. I don't want to stop with those somewhat cliched critiques. Moving through that, I want to think about institutions, building institutions, as tools, as instruments for change through institutions. And on the artist's part, if the artist, freelancer, is to be the model subject of late capitalism, how can he or she do that in the most responsible adult way possible, if that is his or her fate? So, thank you very much.